Have you ever been the punchline of a joke for so long that you start to believe it yourself? For 30 years, that was me. Rex, the family historian. In the Callahan clan, a family of loud, backslapping, whiskey-slinging salesmen, being the historian was like being the court jester, only with less respect. My older brother Caleb was the CEO, a shark in a tailored suit who could sell ice to a polar bear. My sister Brianna was the marketing VP, a woman who could spin a story about a rusty nail and have you believing it was a lost artifact from a king's tomb. They were the engine of Callahan and Sons Distillery. And me? I was the guy in the dusty back office, surrounded by brittle ledgers and sepia-toned photographs, the quiet, unnecessary anchor they were forced to drag along. They were all about the future, the next quarter, the next big ad campaign. They were focused on sales and profit margins, on moving units and expanding into new markets. I was the keeper of the past, the archivist of a legacy they used for branding but never truly understood or respected. My work was a quaint little hobby to them, a harmless eccentricity they could point to during interviews. See, we care about our history. We even have a guy for it. That all changed 3 weeks ago, in the cavernous oak-paneled boardroom that my great-great-grandfather Finis Callahan had built with his own 2 hands. The air was thick with the scent of old leather floor polish and the faint, sweet perfume of our own sour mash that seemed to permeate the very wood of the building. Caleb stood at the head of the table, a smug, triumphant grin plastered on his face. Brianna was beside him, looking like a cat who had just swallowed a whole canary, feathers and all. My mother was there too, her eyes glittering with the prospect of a life even more comfortable than the one she already had. They called it a family meeting, but I knew what it was. It was a coronation, their coronation, the culmination of everything they'd been working towards. Caleb cleared his throat, the sound echoing slightly in the grand room. He tapped a thick stack of papers on the table. "Well, this is it," he announced, his voice booming. "The day we've all been waiting for. Global Beverage Incorporated has made an official offer. 9 figures. For everything." Brianna chimed in, her voice smooth as our finest aged bourbon. "They're buying the land, the distillery, the inventory, the whole operation. It's a turnkey deal. We'll be out, clean and clear, by the end of the quarter. Think of it, Mom, a permanent vacation. No more worrying about grain prices or distribution logistics." My mother dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, a practiced gesture of overwhelming emotion. "Oh, Caleb, Brianna, I'm so proud of you. Your father would be so proud. You've taken his legacy and turned it into this. Legacy." The word hung in the air, heavy and obscene. They were talking about cashing out, about taking 150 years of sweat, struggle and artistry and trading it for a pile of cash. They were selling the soul of our family for a life of leisure. I felt a familiar cold knot tighten in my stomach. I'd spent my entire adult life meticulously preserving that legacy. I had documented every single batch, every change in the mash bill, every award won, every story told by the men who worked the stills. I had restored Finis's original handwritten journal, a book filled with his dreams and his fears and the precise alchemical formula that had started it all. To them, that journal was just a prop for a magazine shoot. To me, it was scripture. I must have made a sound, a quiet sigh or a shift in my chair, because Caleb's eyes swiveled to me, a flicker of annoyance in his gaze. It was the look he always gave me, the one that said, "Oh, right. You're still here." "What's the matter, Rex?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Worried you'll be out of a job? Don't be. I'm sure Global will need someone to dust off the old photos. Or maybe you can finally write that little book you're always talking about. This deal will give you plenty of time for your hobbies." Brianna laughed, a sharp, tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. "Be nice, Caleb. Rex is an important part of the brand narrative. The quirky historian in the attic. It's a great angle. We've used it in 3 different campaigns." She turned to me, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Don't worry, Rex. We'll make sure you get a nice little nest egg, enough to keep you in tweed jackets and archival paper for the rest of your life." The room chuckled. A nice little nest egg. They were talking about a deal that would make them titans, that would put their names in financial magazines, and they were offering me the equivalent of pocket money. It wasn't the money that stung, though. It was the casual, effortless dismissal, the complete and utter inability to see me, to see what I actually did as anything more than a joke. They saw a factory, a collection of buildings and copper pots. They saw a brand, a logo, a set of marketable phrases. They failed to notice that while they were busy building an empire of sales charts and focus groups, I was quietly fortifying the kingdom of our identity. They owned the land and the equipment. Yes, but I owned the story, and I had the paperwork to prove it. 2 years ago, a seed of this moment had been planted, not by me, but by them. Brianna had launched a new aggressive marketing campaign. It was all about authenticity. She'd said she'd taken our great-great-grandfather's face, a beautiful stark charcoal portrait from 1878, and slapped it on everything: billboards, web banners, even coasters in cheap bars. She'd trademarked a new, slick, modernized version of our logo, abandoning the classic, hand-drawn script Finis himself had designed. She was selling a version of our history that was glossy and hollow, and it felt like a violation. That feeling, a deep, protective instinct, sent me to see my grandfather's old lawyer, a man named Arthur Finch. Arthur was in his 80s, sharp as a tack, and the only person left alive besides me who truly remembered what Callahan and Sons was supposed to be. He had been my grandfather's confidant, a man who believed, as he did, that a company's soul was its most valuable asset. I laid out my concerns to Arthur. He listened patiently, his fingers steepled under his chin. When I was done, he looked at me over the top of his spectacles and said something I've never forgotten. "Rex, your family thinks they're in the whiskey business. They're not. They're in the nostalgia business. They're selling a feeling, a connection to a simpler, more authentic time, but they don't respect the source of that authenticity. They're strip mining it, and one day someone is going to come along and want to buy the mine, and your family will be so blinded by the gold they'll give away the deed for free." Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The things that have real, lasting value," he said, "are not the copper stills or the brick warehouses. It's the name. The face of the man who started it all. The shape of that first bottle he designed. The words he used to describe his dream. Those are the crown jewels, my boy. And from what you're telling me, they're just lying in an unlocked drawer." That was the day the quiet, dusty historian started building a fortress. Over the next 6 months, with Arthur's expert guidance, I began the process. I used the money my grandfather had left me in a small private trust, a fund he'd earmarked in his will for the preservation of the Callahan story, to pay the legal fees. First, I trademarked the name Phineas Callahan itself, specifically for use in connection with distilled spirits. Then his likeness, but not the one Brianna was using. I trademarked the original 1878 charcoal portrait, the one with the fierce, proud look in his eyes, the one that hung in my office, and not the boardroom. I trademarked the original bottle design from 1882, a beautiful, imperfect, slightly asymmetrical bottle we called the bell bottom because of its wide, sturdy base. It was the bottle our most loyal longtime customers still asked for, the one my siblings had dismissed as clunky and old-fashioned. Finally, I went through my archives and pulled out every historical slogan, every turn of phrase from Phineas's journal that Brianna had ever lifted for her marketing copy. Forged in the Blue Ridge. Blessed by the creek, the honest dram. Patience in the barrel, truth in the bottle. I trademarked every single one. It was my secret, my quiet act of rebellion, my silent protest against the hollowing out of our family's soul. I never intended to use it as a weapon. I thought of it as a fail-safe, a hidden shield to protect our history from my family's rapacious ambition. But sitting there in that boardroom, being offered a nest egg and a pat on the head, I realized the moment Arthur had predicted had arrived. They weren't just selling the distillery. They were trying to sell my life's work. They were trying to sell Phineas Callahan himself. And the thing is, they couldn't, because he, and everything that truly made him who he was, belonged to me. I let them finish their self-congratulatory toasts. I watched Caleb preen and Brianna bask in the glory of their 9-figure victory. I stayed quiet, the forgotten man in the corner, the court jester. I just sat there and let the silence stretch. Finally, Caleb, impatient to get to the celebratory lunch, looked at me. "Well, nothing to say, Rex? No dusty old proverb for the occasion?" I looked up from my hands and met his gaze. I gave him a small, placid smile. "Just one question," I said, my voice calm and even. "Did the lawyers from Global Beverage do their due diligence on the intellectual property, the trademarks, specifically?" Brianna scoffed. "Of course they did, Rex. Their legal team is the best in the world. I handled the IP portfolio myself. Everything is clean." "Everything?" I asked, letting the word hang in the air. "Are you sure? Did you check the trademarks on, say, the founder's name, his likeness, the original bottle design, or any of the historical slogans you use in all your marketing materials?" A strange look flickered across Brianna's face, a tiny crack in her perfect glossy facade. Caleb just rolled his eyes. "What are you talking about? That's all part of the brand. It's all ours." "No," I said, my voice still quiet, but now it held a new weight, a density that made them all lean in slightly. "It's not. It's mine." The silence that followed was a thing of beauty. It was deeper and more profound than any silence that old boardroom had ever known. It was the sound of a 9-figure deal, grinding to a screeching halt. It was the sound of my family realizing that the jester they'd been laughing at for 30 years was the only one holding the key to the entire kingdom. The conglomerate was buying a factory, but the rights to the brand's soul, they were pending a licensing agreement with me. The immediate aftermath of my quiet little bombshell was pure, unadulterated chaos. Caleb's face went from smug triumph to a blotchy, furious red. He looked like a man who had just been told the winning lottery ticket he was holding was a misprint. He slammed his hand on the table, making the water glasses jump. "What the hell is that supposed to mean, Rex? It's yours? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. It's family property." Brianna, on the other hand, went pale. She was the marketing mind. She understood the implications faster than Caleb, whose brain was wired for blunt force and sales figure. I could see the gears turning in her head, the frantic calculation of what it meant if the slogans, the images, the very name of our founder were not part of the deal. She was a storyteller, and she had just realized the main character of her story was owned by someone else. She started fumbling with her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she tried to pull up the public trademark database. "It's not family property, Caleb," I said, my voice maintaining that same infuriating calm. "Family property is something that belongs to all of us. This is my property. I registered the trademarks myself 2 years ago." 2 years ago, he roared, pushing himself to his feet. "You went behind our backs? You schemed against your own family?" "No," I corrected him gently. "I acted to protect our family's legacy, something you and Brianna were treating like a disposable asset. You were so busy slapping Phineas's face on cheap merchandise and twisting his words into meaningless taglines that you never bothered to check if you actually had the right to do so. You just assumed. You always assume when it comes to the history. You assume it's just there for the taking." My mother, who had been watching this exchange with a look of horrified confusion, finally found her voice. "Rex, honey, this has to be a misunderstanding. Why would you do this? We're your family." I turned to her, and for the first time a flicker of the old hurt surfaced. Because you let them, Mom. You stood by for decades and watched them mock my work. You called it my little project. You never once stood up for me, for the part of this family that isn't about money. You were supposed to be the bridge between your husband's generation and this one, but you just let them burn it down for the insurance money. This was a raw nerve, and I knew it. My father, before he passed, had been a lot like me. He loved the distillery, but he was a craftsman, not a salesman. He'd spend hours with me in the archives, telling me stories about his father and Phineas. He'd taught me how to read the old ledgers, how to identify the faint pencil marks that indicated a change in the yeast strain or a new source for our oak barrels. He had entrusted the story to me. On his deathbed, he'd made me promise to keep the soul alive. And for the last 10 years, Caleb and Brianna had done everything in their power to render that promise meaningless. I remembered one particularly stinging incident about 5 years ago. We were celebrating the 145th anniversary of the distillery. Brianna had planned a huge gala. She wanted to display Phineas's original journal in a glass case at the entrance. I had argued against it. The book was fragile, the light and humidity would damage the pages. I suggested we display a high-quality facsimile instead. Brianna had laughed in my face. "Oh, Rex, don't be so dramatic. Nobody is actually going to read it. It's a prop. It's about the aesthetic. People see the old book and they think authenticity. That's all that matters." I stood my ground. I refused to hand over the journal. The next day I came into my office to find Caleb trying to jimmy the lock on the fireproof cabinet where I kept it. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed when I caught him. He just straightened up and said, "Give me the key, Rex. Don't make this difficult. It's for the good of the company." "The good of the company is preserving its most precious artifact," I had retorted, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and fear. "Not using it as a party decoration." He had gotten right in my face. His voice a low growl. "You are an employee, Rex. A salaried archivist. This book, this office, everything in it belongs to Callahan and Sons, which I run. Now give me the key before I have security. Remove you." I didn't give him the key. I told him he'd have to fire me and break the cabinet open, and I'd make sure every local newspaper heard about how the CEO of Callahan and Sons destroyed his own great-great-grandfather's journal for a party. He had backed down, sputtering with rage. But the line had been drawn. They saw me as an obstacle, a sentimental fool standing in the way of progress. That was the day I realized I couldn't just be a passive guardian. I had to become a protector. That was the day I first thought about calling Arthur Finch. Another memory, more recent, flooded back. Just last year, Brianna had come to me with a new bottle design. It was sleek, minimalist, and utterly generic. It looked like a high-end vodka bottle. She was so proud of it. "This is our future," she'd announced. "It's modern, it's sexy. It will appeal to a younger demographic." "It's not us," I'd said, looking at the design. "It has no character. The bell-bottom bottle is iconic. People recognize it. It feels solid in your hand. It tells a story. It's clunky," she'd snapped back. "It looks like something you'd see in a dusty old western. We need to evolve, Rex. You're so stuck in the past you're going to let it die. The past is the only reason you have a future." I had told her. Without it, we're just another anonymous brown liquid on a crowded shelf. She had just shaken her head and walked away, dismissing me completely. 2 months later, the new bottles were in production, and 2 months after that, I filed the trademark on the original bell-bottom design. I was watching them dismantle our identity piece by piece, and I was quietly picking up the pieces and putting them in my own pocket. Back in the boardroom, the reality of my actions was finally sinking in. Brianna's phone made a small, pathetic didn't sound. She looked up from the screen, her face ashen. "He's telling the truth," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Phineas Callahan. The portrait. The slogans. It's all registered. To Rexford T. Callahan. Address on file. His home address. Caleb stared at her, then at me. The rage was still there, but now it was laced with a dawning, horrified understanding. The 9-figure deal wasn't just on hold. It was on the verge of collapsing entirely. Global Beverage wasn't buying a distillery to create their own brand. They were buying the Callahan and Sons brand. Its history, its story. They were buying 150 years of authenticity. And I, the family joke, the dusty historian, was the sole owner of all of it. This is a shakedown, Caleb snarled, pointing a trembling finger at me. A low, dirty shakedown. You waited until the last possible second to pull this stunt, to try and extort us. Is it? I asked, raising an eyebrow. I seem to recall a conversation where you told me I was a salaried employee and that everything in my office was company property. You were quite clear that I had no real stake in this family, in this business. I was just part of the brand narrative. It seems I took your advice. I decided to build some equity of my own. You and Brianna were focused on the next quarter's sales. I was focused on the next 50 years of the Callahan legacy. We simply had different investment strategies. The catalyst, the final push that turned my defensive shield into an offensive weapon, had come just a week before this meeting. I had overheard Caleb and Brianna talking in the hallway outside my office. They thought I had already left for the day. They were discussing the final details of the sale and what to do with me. We'll give him $1 million tax-free, Caleb had said, his voice casual, as if he were discussing what to have for lunch. That's more than he's earned in his entire life. He can play with his little scraps of paper and be happy. He's going to be sentimental about it. Brianna had replied, he'll talk about legacy and Dad's promise. Then Caleb had laughed. A cold, dismissive laugh that cut me to the core. His legacy is a tax write-off. Dad was a romantic, not a businessman. He enabled Rex's little fantasy world. It's our job to bring this family into the real world. $1 million is more than generous for a glorified librarian. A glorified librarian. That was it. That was the moment the cold knot in my stomach hardened from hurt into something else entirely. It became a solid core of purpose. All those years of being patronized, of being treated as a quaint but useless piece of furniture, coalesced into a single sharp point of clarity. They didn't see me. They didn't see my father in me. They didn't see Phineas. They saw a line item on a budget. They had calculated my worth down to a number, a payoff to make me go away quietly, and they had miscalculated. They had profoundly, catastrophically miscalculated. I looked around the boardroom at their shocked, angry, and frightened faces. My mother was weeping softly now, not out of pride, but out of sheer terror. Brianna was staring into the middle distance, her marketing genius brain probably running 1,000 disastrous scenarios. Caleb was vibrating with a rage so pure it was almost comical. For the first time in my entire life, I had all the power in the room. They had spent years building a house of cards on a foundation of stories they didn't own, and I had just decided to pull my library card. My resolve was no longer just about preservation. It was about justice. It was about making them finally, after all these years, see the true value of the family historian. The plan wasn't born in a flash of anger. It was distilled slowly and deliberately. Over 2 years. It started as a vague sense of unease, and with the help of Arthur Finch matured into a concrete strategy. Arthur was more than just my grandfather's lawyer. He was a historian in his own right, a keeper of corporate souls. When I first visited him in his dusty book-lined office, an office that felt more like a university library than a legal practice, he understood my fears before I had even fully articulated them. Your family is making a classic mistake, Rex, he'd said, peering at me over his half-moon glasses. They think a brand is a logo. A brand is a promise. It's a story the customer tells themselves. And your family's story is potent. It's about a man, Phineas, who built something real with his bare hands. It's about integrity. When you start messing with the core elements of that story, you dilute the promise. You're not just changing a bottle, you're changing the narrative. He was the one who suggested a proactive approach. Possession is 9/10 of the law, he'd mused, but a registered trademark is 10/10. If you believe these assets are being mismanaged and are in danger of being devalued or sold off, then you have a moral, if not yet a legal, imperative to secure them. Our first step was research. Arthur had a paralegal, a young, sharp kid named Ben, who was a wizard with intellectual property law. For a month, Ben and I were inseparable. We spent hours in my archives and in the county records office. I would pull out old bottles, advertisements from the 1920s, letters from my great-great-grandfather, and Ben would cross-reference everything against existing trademark databases. It was a painstaking process. We discovered that my family, in their rush to modernize, had let dozens of old copyrights and trademarks lapse. They were so focused on creating new, slick marketing materials that they'd left the family jewels completely unprotected. It was an astonishing level of negligence, born from pure arrogance. They simply couldn't conceive that anyone would or could challenge their ownership of their own history. It's incredible, Ben had said one afternoon, looking up from his laptop. They trademarked Callahan's crest, the new logo Brianna designed, in 7 different classes. But Phineas Callahan himself, the name is completely open. So is the original bottle design. It's like they built a new vault, but left the old one wide open, with the gold sitting on the floor. This was where my grandfather's foresight came into play. The trust fund he'd left me wasn't massive, but it was enough. It was about $50,000. He had specified its purpose was for the preservation and promotion of the Callahan family history. Paying legal fees to secure the very essence of that history was, in my mind, the purest expression of his wishes. It felt like he was reaching out from the past, handing me the tools I needed to do what had to be done. So we began. The first and most important filing was for the name, Phineas Callahan. Arthur advised we file it narrowly, for use in distilled spirits and the marketing thereof. This was a strategic move. It was specific enough to be defensible, but broad enough to cover everything my family did. Next was the likeness. This required more nuance. Brianna was using a cleaned-up, almost cartoonish version of Phineas's portrait. I, however, had the original glass plate negative of the 1878 charcoal portrait stored in a climate-controlled box. We had a high-resolution scan made and trademarked that specific image, the original, the one with the fire in his eyes. Arthur called it securing the authentic representation. Then came the bottle. The beautiful, clunky, bell-bottom bottle. I had 3 pristine examples from the 1880s in my archive. We photographed them from every angle, documenting the precise curves, the thickness of the glass, the distinct punt at the base. We filed a trade dress trademark on the design. This was a more complex legal maneuver, arguing that the bottle's shape itself was a source identifier for our brand. Our proof was a stack of letters I had collected over the years from old customers, all of them lamenting the new bottle designs and asking where they could find the real Callahan's bottle. It was a treasure trove of evidence, proving that the bottle was synonymous with the brand in the minds of our most loyal consumers. My family had seen those letters as complaints from a dying demographic. Arthur and I saw them as legal ammunition. Finally, the slogans. This was my favorite part. It felt like I was rescuing poetry from the clutches of barbarians. I went through Phineas's journal and every piece of early company correspondence. I compiled a list of over 24 phrases and taglines. Forged in the Blue Ridge, blessed by the creek, the honest dram, a fire in the glass, a warmth in the soul, patience in the barrel, truth in the bottle. Brianna had been cherry-picking these for years, treating them like a public domain buffet. We trademarked every single one. The entire process took nearly a year. It was a silent, secret war being waged from a dusty law office in my archive room, while Caleb was giving keynote speeches about market disruption, and Brianna was winning awards for her vapid ad campaigns. I was quietly building a legal fortress around the heart of the company. My allies were an octogenarian lawyer, a tech-savvy paralegal, and the ghost of my grandfather. It felt clandestine and strangely exhilarating. For the first time, I wasn't just curating the past. I was actively shaping the future. My secret weapon wasn't just the trademarks themselves. It was my family's complete and utter ignorance of their existence. Their arrogance was my shield. They never once asked what I was doing with my time or my small inheritance. They just assumed I was pottering around, laminating old documents and alphabetizing photographs. The idea that the family historian could be engaged in a sophisticated long-term legal strategy was so far outside their realm of imagination that it provided me with perfect cover. I also had another ally, a man who represented the living soul of the distillery, our master distiller, a man named Seamus O'Malley. Seamus was in his late 60s, a third-generation distiller whose father and grandfather had worked the stills for my father and grandfather. He had taught me how to taste whiskey, not just drink it. He could tell you the batch, the year, and sometimes even which side of the rickhouse a barrel had aged on, just from a single sip. He was a quiet, proud man who despised the direction Caleb and Brianna were taking the company. I had confided in Seamus about a year ago, not about the trademarks, but about my fear. We were in the aging warehouse, the air thick with the sweet, heavy scent of the angel's share. "They're selling a picture, Rex," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. "They don't care what's in the bottle anymore, as long as the picture on the outside sells. They've cheapened the grain. They've shortened the aging time on the younger blends. They think I don't notice, but I notice." Phineas Callahan wouldn't spit this new stuff out if his boots were on fire. Seamus became my eyes and ears. He saw the company not from the boardroom, but from the floor. He saw the declining morale of the workers, the shortcuts being taken, the slow erosion of quality. His quiet disapproval was a constant affirmation that I was on the right path. He was the guardian of the liquid, and I was the guardian of the legend. Together we were the keepers of the true Callahan and Sons. When the news of the global beverage deal first started circulating around the distillery, Seamus had come to my office and closed the door. He looked at me with his pale blue, weary eyes. "Is it true, Rex? They're finally selling out?" "It looks that way, Seamus," I had said. He shook his head slowly. 150 years, just to end up as another label in some soulless corporation's portfolio. "It's a damn shame. Your father would be spinning in his grave." "Maybe not, Seamus," I had said, giving him a small knowing look. "Maybe the story isn't over just yet." He had searched my face for a long moment, and a slow smile spread across his lips. He didn't know the details, but he knew me. He knew my love for this place ran deeper than anyone else's. "All right, Rex," he'd said, clapping me on the shoulder. "All right, I'll keep the faith." Now sitting in the smoldering ruins of their 9-figure celebration, I felt a strange sense of peace. The secret I had carried for 2 years was finally out in the open. The hidden leverage was now on the table. This wasn't about extortion. This was about a reckoning. It was about forcing them to acknowledge the value of the one thing they had always taken for granted. They thought they were selling a company. I was about to teach them that they had already given away its soul, and I was the one who had caught it. The panic in the boardroom was like a physical thing, a palpable wave of energy that rolled off my brother and sister. For about 10 minutes after Brianna confirmed the existence of my trademarks, there was just sputtering, incoherent rage from Caleb and a series of frantic, whispered phone calls from Brianna to, I assumed, our family's corporate lawyer. My mother just sat there, looking back and forth between us as if she were watching a tennis match she didn't understand. My first move after the initial reveal was to do absolutely nothing. I just sat there, a picture of calm, and let their panic consume them. This was part of Arthur Finch's advice. Let them flail, Rex, he had told me over the phone the night before the meeting. Their first instinct will be to bully, then to bargain from a position of weakness. Don't engage. Let them exhaust themselves against the wall you've built. The wall is the truth. The wall is the law. And so I sat. Caleb paced the length of the room like a caged animal. This is illegal. You can't do this. You had a fiduciary duty to the company. We'll sue you into the ground, Rex. I swear to God you'll be begging for that nest egg when I'm through with you. I didn't even look at him. I just took a slow sip of my ice water. Brianna finally hung up her phone, her face grim. She shot a look at Caleb that said, "Shut up, you idiot." She then turned to me, her entire demeanor shifting. The panic was gone, replaced by a mask of strange sincerity. It was her "let's be reasonable" face, the one she used on difficult clients. "Rex," she began, her voice smooth and placating. "Okay, clearly there's been a breakdown in communication. We had no idea you'd done this, and frankly it's brilliant, in a way. You saw a weakness in our IP portfolio and you secured it. I can respect that. It shows foresight." I just stared at her, saying nothing. "Look," she continued, leaning forward and folding her hands on the polished table. "This is an internal family matter. We can sort this out. Global Beverage doesn't need to be involved in this. We just need to transfer the trademarks back to the company. Of course, we'll compensate you for your time and the legal fees. We'll even add a handsome bonus for your diligence. We can draw up the papers this afternoon. A simple assignment." She was trying to frame it as a simple clerical error, a bit of housekeeping. She was trying to shrink the problem down to something manageable, something that could be solved with a checkbook. It was a good strategy. It might have even worked if I were the person they thought I was. "They're not for sale, Brianna," I said quietly. Her smile faltered. "What do you mean? They're not for sale?" "Rex, this is a 9-figure deal. Everything is for sale. Not these," I repeated. "They are not, and will not be for sale. I didn't secure them to sell them. I secured them to protect them." Caleb stopped his pacing. "Protect them from what?" "From success. From us turning this dusty old relic into a global powerhouse." "No," I said, finally turning my full attention to him. "I protected them from you, from your greed. You don't see a legacy, you see a commodity. You would have sold Phineas's name and face to the highest bidder without a second thought, and you've just proven it. Global Beverage isn't buying a distillery, Caleb. They are buying a story. 150 years of authenticity. And that story is not yours to sell." Just then, Caleb's phone buzzed. He snatched it up. It was a text message. He read it, and all the color drained from his face. He looked at Brianna, his eyes wide with a new, more profound level of terror. "Oh, it's Mark," he whispered, referring to our main contact at Global Beverage. "Their legal team just got back to them." Brianna's phone buzzed a second later. She read the email that had come through, and her composure finally, completely shattered. "Oh God," she breathed. The conglomerate's due diligence team, having been alerted by Brianna's frantic calls to our own lawyers, had done their job. They had found my trademark, and they had, quite correctly, advised their leadership that the core brand assets they thought they were acquiring were in fact owned by a third party. The text Caleb had received was likely a very polite, very corporate, but very firm message, stating that the deal was on hold, indefinitely. This was the moment the balance of power truly shifted. Up until now, it was a family squabble. Now it was a 9-figure business disaster, and my siblings were standing right at the epicenter. The antagonist panic was a glorious thing to behold. Brianna immediately started trying to spin it. It's fine, she said, more to herself than to anyone else. We just need to explain the situation. We'll tell them it's a family misunderstanding we're resolving. We just need Rex to be reasonable. She looked at me, a new desperation in her eyes. Rex, please, think about what you're doing. You're scuttling the deal of a lifetime. For what? Pride. For principle. I corrected her. There's a difference. Caleb, however, went for a different tactic. He abandoned threats and went straight to begging, which was somehow even more pathetic. Rex, come on. This is everything. This is for Mom, for all of us. A new life. You can't do this. Whatever you want. What's your number? Just tell me the number. It was disgusting. He was still trying to buy me. He still thought this was about money. It was like a man who only spoke one language, trying to communicate with someone who was fluent in a dozen. He simply could not comprehend a motive that wasn't financial. I stood up. I think this meeting is over, I said. I won't be selling the trademarks. However, I am open to discussing a potential licensing agreement. My lawyer, Arthur Finch, will be in touch with your lawyer to discuss the parameters. What? I suggest you also inform Global Beverage that any future negotiations regarding the use of the Callahan brand identity will have to include me and my legal counsel. I turned and walked towards the door. My hand was on the heavy brass knob when my mother's voice, trembling and thin, stopped me. Rexford, she said. I hadn't heard her use my full name in years. Your father would be ashamed of you. I stopped, but I didn't turn around. I let the silence hang for a moment. No, Mom, I said, my voice low and heavy with the weight of years of disappointment. Dad would be ashamed of you. He asked me to protect the soul of this company, and today I finally am. I walked out of the boardroom and closed the door softly behind me, leaving them to the sound of their empire crumbling. Walking down the hallway past the portraits of my ancestors, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in 30 years. The air no longer smelled of just sour mash and old leather. It smelled of liberation. The silent takeover was complete. The panic was just beginning, and the real negotiations were about to start. The days following the boardroom confrontation were a masterclass in desperate manipulation. The first wave was brute force. Caleb, true to form, had our family's corporate lawyers send Arthur a cease and desist letter. It was a laughable document, full of bluster and empty threats, accusing me of trademark infringement on a brand they didn't own, of tortious interference with their deal. Arthur read the whole thing over the phone to me, chuckling like a man reading the funnies. They're accusing you of interfering with the sale of assets you legally control, Rex. He cackled. It's like accusing a homeowner of trespassing in his own living room. This is the legal equivalent of a toddler's temper tantrum. We'll send a response, but frankly, a framed copy of your trademark certificates would be more effective. When the legal thuggery failed, the next wave began. Emotional blackmail, captained by Brianna. She showed up at my house unannounced, something she hadn't done in over a decade. I lived in a small, restored craftsman bungalow on the other side of town, a house I'd bought and renovated myself. It was my sanctuary, filled with books and history, the polar opposite of the sterile modern mansions my siblings inhabited. She stood on my porch, holding a wicker basket containing a bottle of wine and some expensive cheese, a peace offering. Her face was arranged in a mask of sisterly concern. "Can I come in, Rex?" she asked, her voice soft. "We need to talk, just the two of us." I held the door open but didn't move to let her pass. "We can talk right here, Brianna." She sighed, the picture of a long-suffering sibling. "Don't be like this. I know you're hurt. We underestimated you. We took you for granted. I see that now. But you can't let your hurt destroy this family's future. The future you're talking about is a cash payout, Brianna. My future is about ensuring this family's name still means something in 100 years. We have different definitions of the word. This isn't about definitions, it's about Mom, she said, her voice rising. She's a wreck. She can't eat. She can't sleep. You're tearing her apart. Is this what you want? To punish an old woman because your feelings got hurt? It was a low blow, and she knew it. But I was ready for it. Mom is upset because the 9-figure payday she was counting on is in jeopardy. Her distress is financial, not emotional. She made her choice years ago when she decided to stand with the money, not the legacy. This isn't on me, Brianna. This is the consequence of your and Caleb's choices. Her face hardened, the mask of concern slipping to reveal the cold fury underneath. You are the most selfish, arrogant man I have ever met. You sit here in your little hobbit hole surrounded by dead people's junk, and you think you have the right to dictate the future for everyone else. You're pathetic. I may be pathetic, I said, looking her straight in the eye, but I own the name on the bottle of wine in that basket, so if you're finished, I have work to do. I closed the door in her face. The power shift was exhilarating. For years they had wielded all the power of position, of money, of influence. My power was quieter, but it was absolute. It was the power of ownership, the most significant event in this period. The one that truly signaled a sea change, was what I came to think of as the family exodus. It started with Seamus O'Malley. 2 days after my confrontation with Brianna, he walked into Caleb's office, placed his keys on the desk, and retired, effective immediately. Caleb, I learned later, was floored. Seamus was the heart of the distillery. His expertise was irreplaceable. Caleb offered him a massive bonus to stay on through the transition with Global Beverage. He offered to double his pension. Seamus just shook his head. I can't do it, Caleb, he had said, his voice full of a sad finality. I won't be the man who helps you hand over the keys. This place, the real place, is dying, and I won't stick around to watch the vultures pick at the bones. I'm with Rex. He's the only one who still knows what Callahan and Sons is supposed to be. His departure sent a shockwave through the distillery. Seamus was more than just an employee. He was an institution. Within a week, 2 of the other senior distillers, men Seamus had trained himself, also quit in solidarity. Then came the head of the barrel program, a master cooper who had been with us for 40 years. They didn't make a big show of it. They just quietly cleaned out their lockers and left. They were the old guard, the keepers of the craft, and their silent exodus was a devastating vote of no confidence in Caleb and Brianna's leadership. The company was bleeding its soul. The conglomerate wasn't just buying buildings and a brand name, they were buying expertise. And that expertise was walking out the door loyal, not to the CEO or the VP of marketing, but to the quiet, forgotten historian. The final, most desperate act of manipulation came from my mother. She called me, weeping. It was a full-scale guilt assault. How could you do this to me, Rexford? After everything I've done for you, I gave you a home, I supported your interests. This was supposed to be my time to rest, to be secure. Your father would have wanted me to be secure. Dad would have wanted the distillery to be secure. I countered, my voice firm but not unkind. He would have wanted his great-grandfather's name to be respected. The security you're talking about is just a big check. And you're right, he would have wanted you to have that. But not at this cost. Not for the price of our soul. It's just a name. It's just a picture on a bottle, she cried. Why does it matter so much to you? And there it was. The fundamental disconnect. The question that I had been living with my entire life. I finally had the answer. It matters because it's the only thing that's real, I said. The money comes and goes. The deals fall through. The marketing campaigns are forgotten in a year. But that name, that face, that story, that's forever. It's 150 years of men getting up before dawn, of wrestling with oak and fire and grain, of believing in something more than just the bottom line. It matters because it's our identity, and without it, we're nothing. You just never took the time to notice. I ended the call feeling a profound sadness, not for them, but for what they had lost and couldn't even see. They were so blinded by the glare of the money that they couldn't see the treasure they were standing on. The power had shifted completely. They had come at me with threats, with bribes, with emotional blackmail, and with guilt. They had fired all their cannons, and I was still standing. My quiet paper fortress had held. They were out of ammunition, and they finally realized they had no choice. They had to negotiate on my terms. The confrontation was set for a week later, not in our boardroom, but on neutral ground, Arthur Finch's office. It was a masterful stroke of psychological warfare on his part. My family was used to their own turf, the grand, imposing boardroom where they held all the authority. Arthur's office was my territory. It was a space that valued knowledge over profit, history over hype. The walls were lined with thousands of leather-bound books, and the air smelled of old paper and quiet intellect. It was a place where my siblings' brash, corporate swagger would look foolish and out of place. They arrived first, Caleb, Brianna, and their high-priced corporate lawyer, a slick man named Patterson, whose suit probably cost more than my car. They looked tense and uncomfortable, perched on the antique leather chairs in Arthur's waiting room, like crows on a fine china shelf. Then the other party arrived, Mark Jeffries, the head of acquisitions for Global Beverage, and their own legal counsel. Mark was a sharp, no-nonsense man, in his 50s. He gave my siblings a curt, unsmiling nod. The atmosphere was glacial. Arthur and I let them all stew for a good 10 minutes before we made our entrance. I had chosen my attire carefully, not a suit, which was their uniform. I wore a simple, well-tailored tweed jacket, the very thing Brianna had mocked, a crisp white shirt, and dark trousers. I wanted to look exactly like who I was, the family historian, the man who cared more about substance than style. Arthur, in his usual three-piece wool suit, looked like a Supreme Court justice from a bygone era. He radiated a calm, unshakable authority that made Patterson look like a flashy amateur. We all gathered in Arthur's main conference room. It was dominated by a huge mahogany table. Arthur took the seat at the head. He had me sit to his right. He gestured for the others to sit, arranging them so my family was on one side of the table, and the global beverage team was on the other. We were positioned not as adversaries, but as the central point around which they both had to orbit. Arthur began. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. We are here today to discuss the intellectual property portfolio, formerly associated with the Callahan and Sons brand. As you all know, my client, Mr. Rexford Callahan, is the legal and sole owner of the key trademarks, including the founder's name, likeness, original trade dress, and primary marketing slogans. The purpose of this meeting is to outline the terms under which my client is willing to license, and I stress the word licenses, these assets." He slid a slim leather-bound folder in front of Mark Jeffries and another in front of Caleb. "The assets are not for sale," I said, speaking for the first time. My voice was steady and clear. "Let me make that perfectly plain. There is no number you can offer me that will convince me to part with my family's name. I am its guardian, not its seller." Caleb started to speak, but Patterson put a hand on his arm, silencing him. They knew they had no leverage here. Mark Jeffries opened the folder and began to read. His lawyer did the same. I watched their faces carefully. Mark's expression was unreadable, a perfect corporate poker face. "What we are proposing," Arthur continued,
is a comprehensive long-term licensing agreement. The fee will be a percentage of gross revenue from all products bearing the Callahan name or likeness, a significant percentage. He named the number. I saw Caleb flinch. It was an aggressive figure, one that would take a substantial bite out of the profits Global was projecting.
Furthermore, I added, leaning forward, the license comes with conditions. I am to be given a permanent salaried position as chief historian and brand guardian for Callahan and Sons, a division of Global Beverage. I will have a permanent non-voting seat on the board of this new division, and I will have absolute veto power over three things: any changes to the core whiskey recipe, any changes to the original bottle design, and the use of Phineas Callahan's name or likeness in any marketing material. Brianna made a choking sound. Veto power? That's insane. You'd be a bottleneck on every marketing decision we make. No, I said, turning to her. I would be a quality control inspector. I would be the guardian of the authenticity you're so keen to sell. You've proven you can't be trusted with it. You would have sold it for parts. My role will be to ensure that the story you tell is the true story. You want to sell a brand built on 150 years of integrity? Then you will operate with integrity. I then turned to Mark Jeffries. Mr. Jeffries, your company wants to buy our story. I understand that. It's a good story. It's a real story. But you need to understand that you're not just buying a marketing angle. You're buying a legacy. And that legacy requires a steward. My family sees it as a product. I see it as a promise. If you want that promise to continue, you need me to ensure it's never broken. Mark Jeffries finally looked up from the proposal. He looked at me, then at Caleb and Brianna, whose faces were masks of impotent fury. He looked back at me. He wasn't looking at a historian. He was looking at an asset, a vital living asset that was the key to the entire deal. Your percentage is high, Mr. Callahan, he said, his voice even. It reflects the value of what I'm offering. I replied, without my intellectual property, you're buying a regional distillery with aging equipment and a workforce that's currently walking out the door. With my IP, and with me to guarantee its integrity, you're buying one of the most authentic and powerful brand stories in the American spirits market. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He understood. This wasn't a shakedown, it was a value proposition. And what of them? Mark asked, gesturing with his chin toward my siblings. This was the moment, the checkmate. That, I said, looking directly at Caleb, is between you and them. My agreement is with Global Beverage. The sale of the physical assets, the land, the distillery, is their deal. But that deal is now worth considerably less than it was a week ago. The 9-figure offer on the table was for the whole package, the factory, and the soul. They can only sell you the factory. I imagine your offer will have to be adjusted accordingly to reflect that new reality. The blood drained from Caleb's face. He finally understood. I wasn't just taking a piece of the pie. I was fundamentally devaluing their portion of it. The 9-figure dream was dead. They would still get a massive payout for the physical distillery, of course. But the real money, the astronomical sum that Global was willing to pay, was for the brand, and the brand was mine. They were about to get a painful lesson in valuation, a lesson taught by the family historian they thought was worthless. The new reality settled over them like a shroud. They were no longer the masters of the universe. They were just sellers of a factory, and they were about to have their company's value reassessed by a very pragmatic buyer. My vindication wasn't just in the power I now held, it was in making them finally understand the true value of what they had been so willing to throw away. The story, the legacy, the soul, that was where the real treasure was, and they had left it to me to guard it. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Just as I had predicted, Global Beverage's offer for the physical assets was revised dramatically. The new number was less than half of the original 9-figure offer. It was still a fortune by any normal standard, but for Caleb and Brianna,
who had been dreaming of private jets and naming rights on university buildings. It was a crushing defeat. They had been forced to sell the body of the company for a fraction of its original price, while I had retained control of its soul and secured a lucrative future for myself in the process. They were out. I was in. They accepted the deal. They had no choice. Their blustering and threats had been reduced to a quiet, resentful signing of the paper. I didn't attend that final signing. It was their moment of defeat, and I felt no need to gloat. My victory was not in their humiliation, but in the preservation of my life's work. In the months that followed, the new reality took shape. Global Beverage, to their credit, honored every part of our agreement. My official title was Chief Historian and Brand Ambassador, and my office was moved from the dusty archives in the back to a beautiful restored suite in the main building, right next to the new division president. The first thing I did was hang the original 1878 charcoal portrait of Finis Callahan on the wall behind my desk.
My role was exactly as I had defined it. Brianna's generic soulless bottles were melted down and recycled. Production of the classic bell-bottom bottle was restarted, to the absolute delight of our longtime customers and the surprise of the new marketing team, who saw sales of our flagship bourbon jump by 30% in the first quarter. I vetoed 3 different ad campaigns that I felt were disingenuous or strayed from our core story. The new marketing team, comprised of smart professionals from Global, were initially wary of me. They saw me as a creative roadblock, but after a few months they started to see me as a resource, as the ultimate authenticator. They would come to me with ideas, and we would work together to make sure the stories we told were true, not just marketable. One of my first official acts was to call Seamus O'Malley. I offered him his old job back, with a significant raise and the title of Distillery Manager Emeritus. He accepted. Seeing him walk back through the gates, tipping his hat to the workers who cheered his return, was one of the proudest moments of my life. The old guard came back with him. The soul of the craft was restored. My family, on the other hand, went their separate ways. My mother took her share of the money and retired to a golf community in Florida. We speak on holidays. The conversations are polite, strained, and we never ever talk about the distillery. It's a closed chapter, a ghost that haunts the space between our words. Brianna moved to New York. She tried to start her own brand consulting agency, but without the Callahan name and legacy to back her up, she struggled. The last I heard, she was doing freelance marketing for a company that sells high-end dog food. Her genius for spin was still there, but the powerful story was gone. Caleb's fate was the most ironic. He took his money and tried to play the role of a venture capitalist. He made a series of bad, impulsive investments in tech startups and cryptocurrency, trying to recapture the thrill of the big score. He lost millions. He was a great salesman when he had a real quality product with a rich history to sell. But when he was just selling hot air, his magic didn't work. He had spent his life selling a story he never understood, and once it was gone, he found he had nothing left to say. Sometimes I walk through the distillery in the late afternoon, after the tour groups have left and the day's work is winding down. The place is alive again. The air is thick, with the sweet, promising scent of sour mash. The rhythmic hum of the machinery is like a heartbeat. The men and women who work here do so with a renewed sense of pride. They know they're not just making a product, they're part of a story, a true story. I often end my walk in the archives, my old home. It's been cleaned up and organized, but it's still my sanctuary. I'll pull Phineas's journal from its new state-of-the-art archival safe and just hold it. I think about the journey. I think about how it feels to be underestimated, to be the punchline. You know, there's a term in our business called the angel's share. It's the small amount of whiskey that evaporates from the barrel during the aging process. It vanishes into the air, a silent offering to the heavens. For years, my family treated our history like the angel's share. They thought it was an acceptable loss, a negligible price to pay for progress. They never realize that the angel's share is what fills the warehouse with that incredible, intoxicating scent. It's what gives the place its spirit, its soul. They were willing to let it all evaporate, and I just happened to be there to bottle it. So if you're out there, and you feel like the quiet one, the overlooked one, the family historian, in a world of salesmen, let me tell you this: the people who make the most noise aren't always the ones with the most power. The people focused on the next deal are often blind to the true assets. Sometimes, the most valuable thing in the room is the story, the history, the soul, and if you're the one who cares for it, who protects it, who understands its true worth, then you might just find that you're not the court jester, you're the king. Thanks for listening to my story. If you found yourself rooting for the underdog, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you have a story about a time you were underestimated, share it in the comments below. I'd love to read it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about getting the last laugh. Until next time, remember that the quietest person in the room is often the one you should be listening to the most.